He was the king of the underworld, a man who supposedly didn't have a heart to break. She was just a waitress, invisible to the billionaires and warlords filling the room. Kira Lawson thought she could hide the pain. She thought she could hide the bruises painted on her skin by a man who had promised to love her. She was wrong. When the room spun and the darkness took her, she didn't hit the cold floor. She landed in arms made of steel. She didn't expect him to catch her. And she certainly didn't expect the devil himself to look at her battered arm, his eyes turning into endless pools of rage, and whisper the 3 words that would burn the city to the ground. Who hurt you? Matteo Corsetti wasn't asking because he cared. He was asking because someone was about to die. If you want to see what happens next, smash that like button and share this with someone who loves a good mafia romance. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell. You won't want to miss how this story ends. Kira stammered in Matteo's arms, her voice trembling and faint, as if each word had to be wrung from her with whatever strength she had left. It's nothing. I bumped into a door. Please, sir, I need to get back to work. She tried to shape a reassuring smile, but her cracked, dry lips only quivered instead of curving. The old lie, the stale, familiar lie, the one she had repeated hundreds of times in the mirror, to co-workers, to herself. But this time it sounded inside the club's deadly silence, hollow and pathetically meaningless. Matteo said nothing. He only looked at her, eyes like cold steel sweeping over every line of her face as if he were reading a book left open to the world. Kira felt stripped bare, each layer of deception peeled away without mercy under that stare. The club remained frozen, hundreds of eyes fixed on table 1, yet no one dared to breathe too loudly. Jazz still played somewhere in the background, but the sound seemed swallowed by the suffocating air. Kira tried to stand, her legs shaking like willow branches before a storm. I'll lose my job, please. Her voice broke on the last word. In her head, a terrible chain of dominoes began to fall. Losing her job meant no money. No money meant she couldn't pay the debt. Not paying the debt meant Derek would. She couldn't force herself to think further. Memories of dark nights surged back. The punches, the curses, the crash of breaking glass, the sound of her crying in the dark where no one could hear. Tears spilled out before she could stop them, sliding down her cheeks, dropping onto the wrist, still marked with bruises. She trembled in Matteo's arms like a small wounded bird, trapped in a predator's hand, with no strength left to fight. Fear had seeped into her bones long ago. Fear of Derek, fear of poverty, fear of the dark, and now one more fear was added. Fear of the man holding her, the man who, with a single nod, could make people disappear. Matteo stayed silent for a long, drawn-out few seconds. Then he spoke, his voice low and final, like a sentence being handed down. You're done working tonight. Not a question, not a suggestion, an order. He turned to Nico, the large man standing beside the table, his eyes still not free of shock. Get the car. Nico blinked. Sir? He asked again. Not because he hadn't heard, but because he couldn't believe what he'd heard. Matteo Corsetti, a man who never cared about anyone but the work, was telling him to get the car because of an anonymous waitress. Matteo didn't repeat himself. He only looked at Nico, his gaze turning to ice. Get the car. 3 words, 3 bullets. Nico didn't ask anything else. He turned and disappeared into the crowd. Before Kira could react, Matteo had lifted her up, one arm supporting her back, the other under her knees, a Princess Carrie she had only ever seen in movies. She was so light, he frowned, his jaw tightening as if he were holding back anger. When was the last time you ate? Kira opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She couldn't remember. 2 days ago. 3. Derek had thrown her dinner against the wall because she dared to look at her phone while he was talking. Matteo didn't wait for an answer. He walked, cutting across the club floor, and the crowd parted on either side like the Red Sea before Moses. No one dared block his path. No one dared breathe too hard. Frank, the manager, hurried after them, his face drained of color. Mr. Corsetti, if she's caused any trouble. Matteo didn't stop, didn't turn back, didn't even spare him a glance. She quits. Send her final paycheck to my accountant. His voice was flat and cold, as if he were discussing an ordinary business transaction. Frank stood rigid in the middle of the floor, mouth hanging open, staring after the back of the kingpin and the waitress in his arms. At the door, a glossy black limousine was already waiting, Nico standing by the open door. Matteo set Kira into the back seat, unexpectedly gentle, then sat down across from her. The door closed, the sound of the outside world, the music, the voices, the city itself, All of it vanished. There was only silence now, the scent of expensive leather, and the steel eyes of Matteo Corsetti watching her straight through the dark. The limousine's interior was wrapped in ink-black leather, sealed off from the outside world with perfect soundproofing. Streetlights slid past the tinted windows now and then, sketching faint, fleeting bands of light across Matteo's face before vanishing. He sat across from Kira, keeping just enough distance that she wouldn't feel cornered, yet his eyes never left her for even a second. The silence was heavy as lead, pressing down on Kira's chest until it was hard to breathe. She curled into the corner of the seat, a survival instinct embedded deep in her bones. Both hands clamped around the bruised arm as if she could hide the evidence of a truth she couldn't bear to admit. The car glided smoothly along the streets of Manhattan, but inside there was another kind of tension. The tension of prey sitting opposite the hunter, not knowing what fate was waiting. Kira spoke first, her voice trembling and rasped raw. "Where are you taking me?" Matteo didn't answer right away. He tipped his head slightly, as if weighing whether she deserved to know. Then he said, his voice low and level, "Your address." Kira blinked, not understanding. "Why?" This time Matteo looked straight into her eyes, for the first time since they'd gotten into the car. That gaze cut through her, stripping away the thin defenses she'd built over so many years. "Because the man who did this lives there, and I want to see his face." Kira went rigid. The blood in her veins seemed to freeze, her heart stopping for one beat and then racing wildly. How did he know? She hadn't said anything. She hadn't admitted anything. She had lied. About the door. About clumsiness. But Matteo looked at her as if that lie were clear as crystal. He began to speak, his tone cold and precise, like he was reading from an intelligence report. "Bruises this fresh, this frequent. It's not a stranger." Kira wanted to argue, wanted to say something, anything, but her throat closed up. Matteo continued, each sentence like a blade dissecting her life with ruthless accuracy. "It's someone with access, someone who sees you every day." He paused, letting each word sink into the air. "You're terrified of losing your job, not because of rent, because of what happens when you go home without money." Kira felt flayed in broad daylight, every secret she'd tried to bury being dug up one by one. "He's either in your house, or he is your house." The last line hit her heart like a bullet. Tears ran down her cheeks, and this time she didn't bother to wipe them away, didn't bother to hide them. What was the point? This man saw through her the way you see through glass. The silence stretched. Matteo didn't push, didn't ask more. He simply waited, patient, as a hunter who knows the prey will come on its own. At last he spoke, a single word. "Address." Not a question, a command. Kira closed her eyes and drew in a shaky breath. She could keep lying, keep denying, but for what? This man already knew the truth. He was only giving her the chance to say it herself. Her voice broke as she spoke the faded numbers. 247 Crescent Street, apartment 4B, Queens. Each word fell like a small drop of blood from an old wound. In Kira's mind, thoughts whirled like a storm. What had she just done? She had just pulled a mafia boss, one of the most dangerous men in New York, into her miserable apartment, into her battered life, into the chaos she called existence. Derek will die. The thought flashed through her head, and she waited for the horror, waited for the self-disgust. But instead, something else seeped in. Relief. For the first time in so many years, someone had seen the truth. For the first time, she wasn't carrying this secret alone. Even if that someone was a devil, a demon, whatever the world chose to call him. At least the devil had seen her. The car turned, heading toward Queens, where her apartment waited like a grave. Night swallowed the city lights, and Kira had the feeling she was plunging into darkness, not knowing whether what lay ahead was an abyss or salvation. The limousine stopped in front of a worn-down building in Queens, the kind of apartment block where the paint peeled off the walls in large sheets, and the windows were filmed with the grime of decades left to be forgotten. Matteo stepped out first, his eyes sweeping the area with the wary precision of a man who'd lived his whole life in the dark. Nico followed, and then Kira, her feet heavy as if every step dragged her closer to the hell she'd been trying to outrun for so long. They went inside. The stairwell reeked of damp rot and old urine, a smell Kira was so used to she no longer noticed it. But she saw Matteo's nose tighten faintly. The fluorescent light overhead flickered, throwing uneven pools of brightness and shadow. Graffiti coated the stairwell walls, crude drawings and gang names scrawled everywhere. Matteo climbed one step at a time, Nico behind him, Kira between them like a prisoner being escorted back to her cell. She saw Matteo taking in everything, from cracks in the plaster to the sagging apartment doors, his mouth pressed into a hard line. Something passed through his eyes, not disgust or contempt, but something deeper, something more painful, as if he had seen places like this before, in a memory he didn't want to touch. They stopped at the door to apartment 4B, the 4 missing a screw and hanging crooked to one side. Kira felt her heart pounding in her throat, the familiar fear rising like a beast being stirred awake. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You don't have to." But before she could finish, Matteo lifted his hand and knocked, just once. Yet the sound rolled down the hallway like thunder, strong enough to make Kira flinch, powerful enough to announce that whoever stood outside this door was not a man who came to beg. Heavy, irritated footsteps dragged from inside. The door opened, and Derek Holt appeared. A beer bottle hung in his hand. The television blared behind him with a late-night game, and his face was set in that familiar, sour scowl Kira had seen hundreds of times before the storm hit. "Where the hell have you been?" Derek roared when he saw Kira, not even bothering to look at who might be with her. "Where's my money? I told you to bring back the tips tonight. You useless." He stopped mid-insult when his eyes finally registered the 2 men standing behind her. Matteo Corsetti, the face that showed up in every nightmare in New York's criminal world, the face that commanded an entire underground empire. Derek's skin went from flushed red to chalk white in an instant, as if someone had drained every drop of blood from his body. The beer bottle trembled in his hand, nearly slipping. Mr. Corsetti," Derek stammered, his voice suddenly sweet as honey. A ridiculous 180-degree turn. What brings you here? To what do I owe this honor?" He tried to smile, but the smile came out warped and shaking. His eyes were the eyes of prey that had just realized the hunter was standing at the mouth of its den. Matteo didn't answer. He didn't say a word. He simply walked past Derek and into the apartment as if Derek were nothing more than a piece of furniture in the way. Derek didn't dare block him. He only shifted aside, swallowing hard. Matteo stepped into the cramped apartment and began to look around, steel eyes raking over every corner like a detective reading a murder scene. A dent in the wall near the door, the exact size of a human head, plaster split open to reveal brick beneath. A broken plate lay abandoned in the corner of the kitchen, untouched, white shards scattered like knocked-out teeth. The refrigerator hung slightly open, holding nothing but beer and a half-empty bottle of sauce. Empty liquor bottles everywhere, on the table, under the sofa, beside the bed. Matteo stopped in front of another gouge in the living room wall, deeper than the first, clearer, undeniable. He lifted his hand, his fingertips brushing the hollow, as if he were reading a story carved into the wall with blood and tears. Kira looked at that gouge and the world around her blurred. Memory surged in like a tide, pulling her under into the first night he hit her. Derek was drunk, coming home reeking of whiskey and failure from the casino. She was washing dishes, and she dropped a glass. The crash was a fuse to a bomb. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he bellowed, moving in on her. She backed away, apologizing, but it was too late. His hand grabbed her hair, yanked her head back, and slammed her skull into the wall. Pain so sharp she saw stars. Then he let her go. She collapsed to the floor, blood running from her forehead, and afterward, he cried. He dropped to his knees beside her, crying like a child, pulling her into his arms with the same hand that had struck her. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. There'll never be a next time. I promise." She believed him. She stupidly believed him. And there was a next time. And the time after that, and another after that, until there were so many dents in the walls she couldn't count them anymore. Kira blinked and came back to the present. Matteo had lowered his hand from the gouge and turned to look at Derek. He still didn't speak. He only stared. The silence stretched. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, each second like an hour, like a year, like a sentence hanging over a condemned man's head. Derek swallowed, sweat starting to bead on his forehead and soak into his collar. He opened his mouth to say something, to explain, to justify, but no sound came out. Matteo's silence was more terrifying than any threat, like the hush of a storm before it destroys, like the stillness of the sea before it swallows ships whole. At last, Matteo spoke. His voice was as flat as a lake before a storm, not a ripple of feeling on it. "The debt she owes," he said, each word falling like cold drops of water. How much? Derek tried to regain his composure, tried to drape himself in the face of a man who still had a shred of power inside his own apartment. That's between me and her, sir. Private matter. He tried to keep his voice steady, but the tremor slipped through every word like water seeping through a crack. Mateo didn't answer right away. He only stepped closer to Derek, one single step. But that step carried the weight of an entire underground empire. Derek instinctively stepped back, his spine edging nearer to the wall. I'm making it my matter, Mateo said, his voice flat as the surface of a deep well, not a ripple of emotion, yet holding something more terrifying than rage. He stared straight into Derek's eyes, and Derek felt as if he was being seen through to the bone. How much? 2 words, broken apart, like 2 gunshots fired into the air. Derek licked his cracked lips, his mind spinning calculations. Tell the truth or lie. Say less or say more. In the end, survival told him that lying to Matteo Corsetti was digging his own grave. 47,000, he rasped, plus interest. Closer to 60. Kira stepped forward, her voice bursting out before she could control it. No, that's my debt. My father's debt. You can't. She wanted to say she didn't need anyone paying it for her, that she didn't want to owe another man anything, that she'd learned the price of help from men like Derek. But Mateo didn't even look at her. His eyes stayed nailed to Derek, as if Kira didn't exist, as if her words were only wind passing through. I can do whatever I want, he said, without arrogance, without boasting. It was simply the truth, a statement about the nature of the world he ruled. In that world, Matteo Corsetti did what he wanted, and no one had the right to stop him. Matteo turned to Nico, the large man who had stood motionless like a statue by the door this whole time. Wire 60,000 to his employer. Now. His voice was still as calm as if he were ordering dinner in a restaurant. Nico didn't ask again, didn't show surprise. He pulled out his phone, dialed, spoke a few quick, clipped lines of Italian. Derek stood there, eyes wide, unable to believe what he was hearing. $60,000. The sum he had used to bind Kira for years. The sum he used as an excuse to beat her whenever she didn't bring home enough. The sum he believed would keep her beside him forever. And Matteo Corsetti had just flicked his hand and paid it as if it were a cab fare. 30 seconds later, Nico lowered the phone. Done, boss. 2 simple words, but they rang like a death bell for Derek's control over Kira. Derek blinked a few times, trying to process what had just happened. Then he forced a smile, the smile he always used when he wanted to slip out of trouble. The smile he had used on Kira after every time he hit her. So, we're good, right? He asked, his voice full of pitiful hope. She's clear? No hard feelings? He even lifted both hands, palms out, as if surrendering, as if everything had ended neatly. Matteo tilted his head slightly to one side, a small motion that carried an indescribable threat. She's clear with them, he said, putting weight on the word, them. Derek blinked, the smile freezing on his face. What do you mean? He asked, his voice beginning to shake again. Matteo didn't answer with words. He started to walk forward, step by slow step, each one measured, like a predator closing in on prey already trapped. Derek backed up, 1 step, 2, 3, until his back hit the wall. The dent in the plaster, the very dent he had made with Kira's head, was now beside his shoulder. No more room. No way out. Kira stood in the corner, her heart pounding as if it would burst through her ribs. She wanted to turn away, to shut her eyes, but she couldn't. Her gaze stayed locked on what was happening, on the man who had once terrified her, now trembling like a worm beneath Matteo's heel. Matteo stopped when there was only a hand's span between him and Derek. He was taller than Derek, broader through the shoulders, and his presence swallowed the man in front of him whole. Derek had to tip his chin up to look at him, his neck bent back, sweat streaming down his forehead. You touched something that wasn't yours to touch, Matteo said, his voice still frighteningly calm. Derek stammered, spittle flying as he tried to explain. I didn't know she was yours, I swear, if I knew. Matteo tipped his head, just a fraction, as if weighing the words. She wasn't, he answered. Not then. A flicker of hope sparked in Derek's eyes, but Matteo extinguished it at once. But you still touched her. You still broke her. His tone stayed level, yet something lived inside it. Something colder than ice, sharper than a blade. And that. Matteo bent down, his mouth close to Derek's ear, close enough that Derek could feel the mafia boss's warm breath against his skin. requires a different kind of payment. Then Matteo began to whisper. Kira couldn't hear the words. She only saw Matteo's mouth moving at Derek's ear, slow and unhurried, like a death sentence being read aloud. And Derek began to shake. Not the shaking from before, not the ordinary shaking of fear. He shook like a man watching the gates of hell open in front of him, like a man hearing his own death described in exact detail. The color drained from his face, leaving an ash-gray pallor, the color of a corpse. Kira stood a few yards away, her back against the wall, her legs shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. She couldn't hear anything. Matteo's whisper was too soft, his voice nothing more than a faint breath, not enough to cross even the short stretch of space between them. All she could do was watch Matteo's mouth moving at Derek's ear, slow, one word at a time, as if he were reading a sentence that had been written long before tonight, a sentence with no appeal, no mercy. His face remained calm as the surface of an autumn lake, not a ripple of emotion, while the words he spoke were clearly destroying the man in front of him piece by piece. Kira had never seen anything more terrifying than that calm, the composure of a man who held life and death in his hands and knew exactly how to use it. Derek's face began to change. From the first sick whiteness, it shifted to ash gray, then to the bluish cast of a corpse gone cold. His eyes widened, his pupils shrinking into two pinpoints, as if he were staring at something more horrific than any nightmare. He started to shake, but not the familiar trembling of ordinary fear Kira had seen so many times. This was the shaking of someone standing at the edge of hell and looking down, the shaking of a man who had finally realized he'd angered the wrong person and now would pay with everything he had. Tears began to slide down Derek's cheeks, running to his chin, dripping onto the floor. The abuser was crying. The man who had made her cry for so many nights was crying like a child caught doing something wrong. Please, Derek stammered, his voice breaking into pieces that couldn't be put back together. Please, I didn't mean... I'll never... He tried to say something, to beg, to justify himself. But Matteo didn't stop. He kept whispering, word by word, slow and merciless, as if Derek's pleas were nothing more than cicadas outside a window, not worth noticing. At last, Matteo fell silent. He straightened, stepped back a single pace, and drew a white handkerchief from the pocket of his suit. He wiped his fingers, slowly, carefully, as if he'd touched something filthy and was washing it away. That gesture was more humiliating than any punch. Derek didn't stand anymore. He slid down the wall and ended up sitting on the dirty floor, legs stretched out in front of him, arms hanging limp at his sides. Yes, sir, he babbled. And it wasn't the voice of the abuser Kira knew. It was the voice of a creature that had been broken completely. I understand. I'll disappear. You'll never see me again. Never. Never. He repeated the words like a prayer, as if saying them enough times would make them true, would save him from the fate Matteo had just drawn for him. Matteo turned to Kira, and when he looked at her, something in his eyes shifted. No longer ice-cold the way they had been on Derek, still not what anyone would call warm, but at least softer. Get your things, he said, his tone still a command, but no longer as sharp as before. You have 5 minutes. Kira nodded, not trusting her voice if she tried to speak. She glanced at Derek, the man who had terrified her so deeply she barely dared to breathe inside her own home, the nightmare waiting every time she closed her eyes. Now he sat there on the floor, crying like a child, shaking like a leaf in a storm, unable to lift his head to look at her. Part of Kira wanted to know what Matteo had said, what words he'd used to dismantle a human being this completely. But another part, a deeper part, knew she probably didn't want to know. Maybe some things were better left sunk in the dark. She turned and walked toward the bedroom to gather whatever was left of her old life. Behind her, Derek didn't dare watch her go. The apartment door closed. Footsteps faded down the hallway, then disappeared. They were gone. Derek remained on the floor, his back against the wall with the dent he himself had made, his legs stretched out in front of him like two useless logs. He wanted to stand, but he couldn't. His body no longer obeyed him, as if his soul had been drained out, and only an empty shell remained. The apartment was suffocatingly quiet. The television still played in the corner, a commentator shouting about some goal, but Derek heard none of it. There was only one thing in his ears, Matteo Corsetti's voice, looping inside his head like a haunted song that could not be shut off. I won't kill you tonight. The words echoed, low and cold as wind off a graveyard. Derek closed his eyes, but that only made the voice sharper, clearer, as if Mateo were still right there, his mouth still close to Derek's ear. That would be too easy. Derek remembered every word, every pause, every chill breath against his skin. I'll give you 24 hours to disappear. Change your name, change your city, change your life. Become someone else, somewhere else, and forget you ever existed in New York. He could feel his stomach turn as the memory continued. If after 24 hours I still hear your name anywhere, if any of my people still see your shadow on these streets. Mateo's voice had gone softer then, almost gentle, and that gentleness was the most terrifying part of all. I'll find every person you have ever loved, every person you have ever cared about, your mother in Florida, your sister in Boston, the ex-girlfriend whose number you still keep. Derek felt sick as he remembered what came next. And I'll let you watch them die, one by one, slowly. I'll send you a video every day, so you understand it is you who killed them. A pause, and then the final line, light as breath, then it will be your turn, and you'll beg to die from the very first day. Derek opened his eyes and drew in a trembling breath. 24 hours. He looked at the clock on the wall, the second hand moving, counting down each moment. No time left for fear, no time left for self-pity. He had to go. His legs shook as he forced himself up, bracing against the wall to keep his balance. He staggered into the bedroom, yanked open the closet, and threw a few sets of clothes into a duffel bag. He didn't need much, only enough to leave. He didn't look back at the apartment, didn't turn off the television, didn't lock the door. He only walked out, down the stairs, into the night street, and vanished into the darkness as if he had never existed. Apartment 4B became empty, holding only the television's noise and the dents in the wall like scars from the past. Derek Holt disappeared from New York that night. No one saw him again. No one looked for him, and no one remembered him. Kira stepped into the bedroom and stopped in the doorway, looking around the small room she had called home for 2 years. 4 pale yellow walls gone dull with age, a narrow bed with worn sheets, a lopsided wardrobe in the corner. This had been home. She had tried to convince herself of that every day, that this was where she belonged, that things would get better, that Derek would change. But now, standing here with her eyes finally open, she saw it for what it truly was. A prison. A cage she had locked herself inside because she had been too afraid to find a way out. She opened the wardrobe, and her heart tightened when she saw it was almost empty. Everything she owned after 27 years of life fit into a single small suitcase. A few sets of clothes, mostly long-sleeved, high-necked things, the kinds that could hide bruises. No pretty dresses, no high heels, nothing that belonged to an ordinary girl her age. Her hand brushed an old sketchbook tucked in the corner, coated in a thick layer of dust because it hadn't been opened since the day she moved in. Once, she had drawn every day, had dreamed of opening her own studio, had believed art was how she would change her life. Now the sketchbook was only a relic of a dream that had died. She slipped it into the suitcase along with an old wallet. Inside was the only photograph she had of her father, the man who had left her a crushing debt, but also the only man who had ever loved her with his whole heart. Her entire life, packed into a bag, light enough to be pathetic. She pulled the suitcase into the living room and stopped. Derek wasn't there anymore. The corner where he had collapsed was empty now, only a smear of sweat on the floor. Maybe he'd vanished into the bathroom, or maybe he'd already run, scurrying like a rat in a game of cat and mouse. She didn't care. She paused at the apartment door and looked back one last time. The dent in the wall near the window, where her head had hit more times than she could count. The old bloodstain on the kitchen floor she had never been able to scrub completely clean. Painful memories stamped into every corner, every patch of wall, every tile. She waited for sadness to crash over her, waited for regret or heartbreak at leaving this place behind. But there was nothing. Only relief, pure and deep, like a 1,000-pound stone finally lifted off her chest after all these years. She stepped into the hallway and closed the door to apartment 4B behind her without looking back. The fluorescent light still flickered overhead like a strange goodbye, shining down on the stairs as she went. Every step away from the apartment was a step closer to... where? She didn't know. She was following a mafia boss she had met only hours ago, going somewhere she didn't know, for reasons she didn't understand. It should have terrified her, but she was too tired to be afraid, and besides, anywhere was better than staying here. At the building's front door, the black limousine still waited at the curb, gleaming under the streetlights like a creature from another world. Mateo stood beside it with his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. He watched her come out, watched the small suitcase in her hand, but he said nothing. He only opened the car door and waited. She climbed in, and the door shut behind her. The car started moving, leaving Queens, leaving the bleak neighborhood where she had lived for 2 years. Kira stared out the window for a moment, watching the old buildings slide away behind them, then turned to Mateo. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice rough with exhaustion. "You don't know me." Mateo didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on the window across from him. "I know enough." She frowned. "I can't pay you back $60,000. He still didn't turn. "I'm not asking." Kira swallowed hard. The next question slipped out before she could stop it. "Then what do you want?" Silence stretched, heavy and full of meaning. City lights moved across the glass, tracing bands of light over the hard angles of Mateo's face. "Finally," he answered, his voice low and distant, as if he were speaking to himself. "I don't know yet." The car kept going, over the bridge, leaving Manhattan, heading toward Long Island. Kira no longer had the strength to ask more. She managed only one last question. "Where are we going?" Mateo answered without looking back. "Somewhere safe." Those 2 words, simple and promising nothing, were enough. She didn't ask again. Her body was giving out, the exhaustion piled up over so many years finally demanding release. Her eyes closed, her head settling against the soft leather seat. For the first time in months, maybe years, she wasn't afraid to close her eyes. She wasn't afraid she'd wake in the night to the sound of Derek drunk. She wasn't afraid she'd be hit for some meaningless reason. She fell asleep in a stranger's car, and strangely, she felt safer than she ever had. Kira opened her eyes, and it took her a moment to realize where she was. The car was still moving, smooth as if it were gliding on clouds, and through the window a massive iron gate was slowly swinging open. A stylized letter C, forged in black iron, stood out between 2 stone pillars, imposing as the entrance to a kingdom. Beyond the gate stretched a road of pure white gravel, winding between rows of ancient oak trees so thick their trunks would take 2 people to wrap their arms around. A marble fountain stood at the center of the circular drive, water shooting high and falling back down like crystal threads glittering under the lights. Stone statues, perfectly trimmed flower beds, and a sweep of vivid green lawn ran all the way to the horizon. Then the mansion came into view, and Kira forgot to breathe. White marble bright as snow, enormous Roman columns holding up a broad portico, windows as tall as cathedral windows with red velvet curtains shifting in the shadows behind the glass. This wasn't a house. This was a palace. "This is where you live?" she blurted, her voice unable to hide her disbelief. Mateo didn't turn, only answered shortly. "This is where you'll stay. For now." The car stopped at the front entrance, and before Kira could react, the huge oak doors had already opened. A middle-aged woman in a crisp black and white uniform stood waiting, bowing as Mateo stepped out. Kira followed, her legs trembling as she climbed the stone steps, her hand gripping her torn suitcase as if it were the only lifeline in a foreign ocean. Inside was even more overwhelming than outside. The marble floor shone so brightly she could see her reflection. A crystal chandelier hung from a ceiling that seemed impossibly high. Antique paintings in gilded frames covered the walls. The air carried the faint scent of fresh flowers mixed with rare wood and leather. Kira felt as if she'd stepped into another world, one that existed only in films and novels. She looked down at herself. The dirty, wrinkled server uniform, the old shoes worn down at the heels, the ripped suitcase with a zipper broken on one side. She stood out like a black ink stain on a blank white page. And yet, strangely, no one looked at her as if she didn't belong. The servants bowed to her with genuine respect, as if she were an honored guest, not a battered waitress picked up out of Queens. Mateo stopped in the center of the grand hall and turned to the middle-aged woman. "Guest room, East Wing. Maria will show you." The maid named Maria dipped her head and stepped to Kira's side, offering a gentle smile. "Please follow me, miss." Kira started to follow, but Mateo's voice cut in behind her. "Dr. Warren will be here in 1 hour." She turned back, frowning. "I don't need a doctor." Mateo looked at her, steel eyes without a ripple of emotion, and his voice left no room for argument. "That wasn't a question." Then he turned away and walked into another room, the door closing behind him, leaving Kira standing there with 100 unanswered questions. 1 hour later, Dr. Warren arrived. He was a man around 55, white hair combed neatly back, gold-rimmed glasses, the professional calm of someone who'd seen too much in life to be easily surprised. He examined Kira in the spacious guest room, gentle and meticulous, his older hands still deft as he checked every bruise, every scar. Kira tried to hide, tried to shrink away, tried to pretend it wasn't as bad as it really was. But the doctor had seen too much to be fooled by clumsy lies. He didn't judge, didn't pry, didn't show pity. He only wrote, slowly and carefully, each note like another piece of a dark picture he was assembling. When the exam was finished, Dr. Warren told Kira to rest and went to see Matteo in the study. The room was dark, lit only by a desk lamp and the firelight from the hearth. Matteo sat behind a desk of black oak, his face half lit and half in shadow, like the man himself. The doctor sat across from him, set the file on the desk, and began his report in an even, low voice. 2 fractured ribs, healing but not properly set. She'll need rest and possibly physiotherapy. Matteo said nothing, sitting motionless as stone. Dr. Warren continued. Multiple contusions, varying ages. This has been ongoing for months, possibly longer. Still silence. Mild malnutrition. She hasn't been eating enough, or hasn't been allowed to eat enough. Matteo's fist tightened on the desktop, knuckles whitening. The doctor paused before he went on, his voice dropping. And the scarring on her back, older injuries. Years old. This girl didn't just get beaten recently. Mr. Corsetti. Matteo finally spoke, his voice like gravel. Years. Doctor. Warren nodded, his seasoned eyes heavy with sorrow. This girl has been surviving for a very long time. The doctor left, and Matteo was alone in the study. He poured a glass of whiskey from the bottle on the shelf, but he didn't drink. He only held it, watching the amber liquid turn and turn. Then he looked down at his other hand, the one trembling slightly. Not from fear. Matteo Corsetti didn't know fear. He trembled from anger. A deep, primal anger. The kind he thought he'd buried long ago, along with the memories of his mother. He set the whiskey down, picked up the phone, and dialed Nico. Derek Holt, he said, his voice cold as ice. I want eyes on him, if he's still in the city by sunrise. He stopped, jaw clenched so hard he could almost hear his teeth grinding. Make sure he regrets it. He ended the call, placed the phone down, and stared out the window into the night. Upstairs, in the luxurious guest room with a bed soft as clouds and silk blankets, Kira was sleeping. The first sleep in years where she didn't have to be afraid to close her eyes. She didn't know that downstairs, in the darkness of the study, a mafia boss was awake because of her, and the anger inside him was smoldering like hot coals waiting to flare. A week passed in the mansion like a dream Kira didn't dare believe was real. The first 2 days, she did nothing but sleep, more than she'd ever slept in her life, sleeping without jolting awake in the middle of the night in fear, sleeping on a bed soft as clouds with silk blankets that cradled her bruised body. By the 3rd and 4th day, she began to eat proper meals. Maria, the maid assigned to care for her, couldn't hide her surprise when she saw Kira eating quickly, as if someone might snatch the plate from her hands. It was an old habit, a habit from the days with Derek, when a meal could be thrown against the wall at any moment. But here, no one took her food. No one screamed in her face. No one hit her for eating too slowly or too fast. On the 5th day, she dared to leave her room and wander through the enormous house. She found the library in the east wing, a 2-story room with shelves that rose to the ceiling, a spiral staircase of oak, and tall windows that looked out onto the garden. She stood there for a long time, doing nothing but looking, breathing, letting herself feel the peace she thought she'd forgotten how to recognize. On the 6th day, she opened her sketchbook for the first time in 2 years. Her hand shook as she held the pencil, the first lines clumsy and uncertain, but she drew. She drew the window frame, the vase of flowers on the table, anything she could see, and with each line, she felt a small part of her old self beginning to return. On the 7th day, the bruises on her body started to fade, and her ribs hurt less when she breathed. All week, Matteo kept his distance. She rarely saw him, and when she did, he only gave a slight nod and kept walking. But she knew he was still watching. Fresh flowers appeared in her room every day, a different kind each time. Books she had casually mentioned in brief conversation with Maria suddenly appeared on her nightstand. He said nothing, but he noticed everything. On the 10th night, Kira couldn't sleep. Old nightmares tried to creep back into her rest, and she woke at 2 a.m. with her heart racing and sweat soaking her back. She lay there for a while, trying to steady herself, then decided to go down to the library. Maybe a book would help her forget the ghosts. The library was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the fireplace and a dim pool of light from a small lamp in the corner. Kira was about to step in when she stopped. She wasn't alone. Matteo sat in a red velvet armchair beside the fire, a book open in his hands, flames dancing across the hard planes of his face. He looked up at the sound of her footsteps, and their eyes met. They were both surprised. "Can't sleep?" Matteo asked, his voice low and gentle in the quiet. Kira hesitated for a second, then answered, "Bad habit." He didn't say anything else, only nodded slightly toward the chair across from him. She sat down, drawing her legs up onto the seat, hugging her knees to her chest like a thin layer of armor. They talked, not heavy, meaningful conversations, just quiet exchanges about books, about the library, about this house. Matteo asked about the sketchbook he'd seen her carrying. Kira told him, her voice growing smaller as she touched memories she'd buried. She had studied graphic design, had a full scholarship, had once dreamed of opening her own studio one day. "What happened?" Matteo asked. Kira stared into the fire. "Life. Dad got sick. Debt piled up. I dropped out to work." She didn't say more about Derek, about how he appeared, how she got trapped. She didn't need to. Matteo already knew. Silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Then Kira looked at him, curiosity pushing past fear. "Your turn. What made you... this?" Matteo lifted a brow. "This?" Kira gave a faint smile, the first time she had smiled in front of him. "King of the underworld." Matteo didn't answer right away. He watched the fire, his gaze distant, as if he were looking into a past he never wanted to remember. "My mother, Isabella." His voice changed when he said the name, softer, more painful. "She was... light. In a world of darkness, she was the only light I knew." Kira listened without interrupting, without probing. She only sat there, giving him room to say what he may never have said to anyone. "My father was a violent man. Not to me. Never to me. To her." Kira held her breath. She understood. She understood too well. Matteo went on, his voice like cold stone while his eyes burned. "I was 16 when she died. He pushed her down the stairs, called it an accident. Everyone believed him. He was powerful. No one dared question." He stopped, jaw tightening. "I couldn't protect her. I was too young, too weak. I watched her fall and I couldn't do anything." Silence settled, heavy as lead. Kira didn't know what to say, wasn't sure any words could soothe a wound that deep. Matteo looked at her, and in that moment she saw what no one was allowed to see in the eyes of a mafia boss. Pain. "I swore I would never be weak again. Never let anyone hurt someone I..." He stopped, not finishing the sentence. But Kira understood. She understood why he had done what he did that night. Not out of pity, not out of possession. He had seen his mother in her, had seen a chance to save the person he couldn't save 20 years ago. This was how he paid a debt to Isabella's soul. After the story, silence covered them again. But it wasn't heavy anymore. It was lighter, easier, like the quiet between two people who had shared their deepest secrets and no longer needed to pretend. Kira pulled out her sketchbook and flipped to a blank page. "Can I draw you?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Matteo looked startled, a rare expression on a face that was usually composed. "Draw me?" Kira nodded. "I need practice. And you have an interesting face." Matteo watched her for a moment, then the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, almost a smile. "Interesting." He repeated the word as if tasting it. "Most people say terrifying." Kira tilted her head. "Maybe that's interesting to me." Matteo sat still. An unusual thing for a man used to controlling everything and always moving. But he sat there, letting the firelight shape his face, letting her draw. Kira focused, pencil moving over the paper, her eyes shifting between him and the page. For the first time in a long time, she forgot fear, forgot the bruises not fully healed, forgot the past. There was only her, the pencil, and the man in front of her. Silence held them, broken only by the crackle of burning wood and the soft scratch of graphite on paper. 20 minutes later, she stopped. "Done." Matteo stood and came to look over her shoulder. And he stood there a long time, saying nothing. The portrait wasn't the terrifying man the world saw, not the mafia boss with steel-cold eyes. In Kira's drawing, the light was softer, the angles gentler, and his eyes were not cold. They were sad, deep and lonely. "You drew me different," Matteo said, his voice rougher than usual. Kira looked up, their eyes meeting at a distance so close she could count his lashes. "I drew what I see," she answered, her voice like breath. Something shifted in the air between them. Something invisible but unmistakable, like an electric current. Then Matteo stepped back, breaking the moment. "Keep it," he said, his voice returning to normal. "I don't need to see myself." He turned and walked out of the library, leaving Kira sitting there with the drawing in her hands and her heart beating out of rhythm. The next day, when Kira passed Matteo's study, she stopped. The door was slightly open, and through the narrow gap she saw her drawing. It had been framed in black oak and hung on the wall across from his desk, placed where he would see it every time he looked up. He said he didn't need to see himself, but he wanted to keep the way she saw him. The next 2 weeks passed, and a new routine slowly took shape inside the mansion. Every evening, Kira and Matteo ate dinner together in the grand dining room, seated at opposite ends of a table so long they might as well have been strangers. But little by little that distance narrowed, until they were sitting side by side, close enough to hear the other breathe. After dinner, they often settled in the library, talking by the fireplace until late. No one spoke of feelings. No one named what was forming between them, but the tension was as obvious as a string drawn tight to the point of snapping. Every time their hands brushed by accident as they reached for the same book, every time their eyes held for too long, the air seemed to thicken, heavy and expectant. Yet Matteo was always the one to step back first. He kept distance as if he feared that if he came any closer, he would break something fragile. One night, after dinner, while they sat in the library with a glass of wine in hand, Kira finally asked the question that had haunted her for days. "Derek." The name came out softly, but it carried in the quiet room. Matteo paused halfway through, lifting his glass. He set it down, slowly, carefully, and looked at her. His steel eyes swept over her face as if deciding whether she was ready to hear the answer. "He's no longer a problem," he said at last, his voice flat as still water. Kira shook her head. "That's not an answer." Silence stretched. The fire crackled, their shadows moving across the walls. Kira drew in a deep breath and asked it directly. "Did you kill him?" Matteo didn't dodge, didn't justify, didn't explain. He only looked at her, unblinking, and answered with a question. "Do you want me to lie?" And Kira understood. Derek was dead, or worse than dead. If there was anything worse than death in Matteo Corsetti's world, she waited for disgust to crash over her, for fear to coil in her stomach, for instinct to scream at her to run from this room, from this man, from this house. But nothing came. No disgust, no fear. Only something else. Something she didn't dare admit. Relief. She felt relief. And that was what frightened her more than Derek ever had. She looked down at her hands. Hands Derek had once bent backward in a drunken rage, now healed, with only a faint scar running along her little finger. She remembered the nights she lay crying in the dark, begging anyone who could hear, begging to be saved, begging for someone to come and pull her out of hell. No one came, no one heard, until that night, until she fell and landed in the arms of the devil. "Am I becoming like him?" she asked herself, her inner voice trembling. "Who am I becoming? Am I glad a man is dead? Am I relieved someone has been killed? Or was she only learning how to live after surviving? Was this the price of survival, losing a piece of your humanity just to keep existing?" Matteo watched her, reading the battle on her face like an open book. He had seen this before, in others, in himself, a victim meeting the truth for the first time, that sometimes, to destroy a monster, it took another monster. "You're not broken for feeling relief, Kira," he said, his voice low and unexpectedly gentle. She looked up at him, eyes wet but not spilling. "You're human," he went on. "Humans feel relief when their tormentors disappear. That doesn't make you a monster." Kira swallowed hard, her voice rough when she spoke. "What if I'm becoming something else? What if being here, with you, is changing me into something I won't recognize?" Matteo looked at her, and in that moment the steel mask of the mafia boss seemed to melt, revealing the man beneath, a man still wrestling with his own darkness. "Then we'll be monsters together," he said. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a promise of happiness or a bright future. But it was a promise all the same. A promise that she would not have to face the dark alone. A few days after that conversation about monsters and darkness, everything seemed to return to normal, or at least to whatever passed for normal inside a mafia boss's mansion. That night's dinner was laid out formally, candles glowing on the table, red wine in crystal glasses, and food prepared by a private chef. But what made that night different wasn't the food or the wine. It was laughter. Kira laughed, not the strained, polite smile she used to paste on her face while serving customers at the Gilded Cage. This was real laughter, rising from deep in her chest, making her eyes crease and her cheeks flush. Matteo told a story about Nico when he was younger, and she laughed as if it were the funniest thing she'd ever heard. Matteo couldn't take his eyes off her. He watched the candlelight dance across her face, watched how laughter brightened eyes that had grown too familiar with tears. It was the first time he'd seen her truly laugh, and he wanted to hold on to this moment. Everything felt peaceful. His phone buzzed on the table, shattering the moment. He glanced at the screen, and in an instant, one brief second, his face changed, jaw tightening, eyes going cold, muscles tensing as if ready for a fight. Then the calm mask returned, so fast Kira almost thought she'd imagined it. Almost. "Excuse me," he said, voice normal, and rose to step out onto the balcony. The glass door slid shut behind him, cutting off sound. Kira stayed at the table, wineglass in her hand, watching him through the pain. She saw him lift the phone to his ear, saw his shoulders stiffen, saw his other hand clamp the railing until his knuckles went white. Whatever that call was, it wasn't good news. Outside on the balcony, Matteo listened to Nico's voice on the other end, each word like a bullet to the chest. "Boss, we have a problem. Carlo Valetti knows about the girl." Matteo tightened his grip on the phone. Carlo Valetti, the head of a rival mafia family, the man who had been trying to topple the Corsetti empire for years. "How?" Matteo asked, his voice cold as ice. Nico answered, tense. "There was someone at the club that night. Sold the information. Valetti pays well for anything about you, and someone sold him news about the girl." Silence stretched along the line. Then Nico continued, cautious. "Valetti's looking for a way to hit you, boss. She's a weak point. They'll use her to distract you. Or worse." Matteo stared into the dark, jaw grinding. "She's not a weakness." Nico let out a breath. "To them, she is. Valetti doesn't care what she is to you. He only cares how she can be used." Silence. "What do you want to do, boss?" Matteo answered, his voice like steel. "Double security. No one in or out without my approval. Every entrance, every window, every shadow." He paused. "And find whoever sold that information. I want a name by morning." Matteo went back inside, his face calm again as if nothing had happened. Kira watched him, set her wine down. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes sharp. Matteo sat down and picked up his napkin. "Business. Nothing important." A smile touched his mouth, but it didn't reach his eyes. Kira didn't fully believe him. She knew something was wrong. The survival instinct honed over years with Derek was screaming inside her head. But she didn't press. "Not yet. You should get some rest," Matteo said. "It's late." Kira nodded, stood up, and felt his gaze follow her until she disappeared behind the door. After Kira went to bed, Matteo stood alone at the window in his study, looking out at the night wrapped around the gardens. They were coming. He knew it. Carlo Valetti wasn't the kind of man who gathered information and let it sit. He would act, sooner or later. And when he did, Matteo had to be ready. But first, he had to keep her safe. That night, Matteo didn't sleep. He patrolled the estate until dawn painted the horizon pink, checking every door, every lock, every blind corner. In the room in the east wing, Kira slept deeply, unaware that a storm was on its way. 3 a.m. Kira opened her eyes and didn't know why. No sound had woken her. No nightmare had dragged her out of sleep. It was only a feeling, vague but persistent, as if something was wrong. The air in the room suddenly felt heavier, quieter, and the survival instinct honed by years of living in fear was screaming in her head that something was off. She lay there for a while, trying to close her eyes and fall back asleep, but she couldn't. Sleep had abandoned her like a traitorous friend. Finally, she sat up, slipped a robe over her shoulders, and decided to go down to the library. It had become her new habit on sleepless nights, sitting in that room of books by the fireplace until her eyes grew heavy. The library was pitch dark when she entered. No one had lit the fire tonight. No lamps were on. Only moonlight poured through the tall windows, laying silver shadows across the wooden floor and the soaring shelves. Kira didn't turn on a light. She liked this peaceful darkness, the kind that held no threat, that didn't hide a drunken abuser. She lowered herself into the familiar armchair by the window, the place where she and Matteo had talked until late, where she had drawn his portrait by firelight. She closed her eyes, breathed in slowly, and tried to let the quiet soothe her uneasy mind. Then she heard it, the sound of glass being cut, soft, almost unnoticeable, like a fingernail scratching a smooth surface. But in the absolute silence of 3 a.m, it rang out as clearly as an alarm bell. Kira's eyes snapped open. She turned toward the sound, and her heart stopped. At the large window on the east side of the library, a dark shape was climbing in through a freshly cut opening. Kira froze, her body refusing to obey her brain. Her feet stuck to the floor as if cement had been poured around them. The shadow slipped fully inside, straightened, and the moonlight revealed him. A black mask hid his face. Black clothing clung to his body, and in his hand was a pistol with a suppressor long as a death drawn out. The assassin moved like a ghost, silent, sweeping the room with cold eyes behind the mask. Then he saw her, and the gun leveled straight at her chest. Kira couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't breathe. Time seemed to stop, each second stretching into an hour, into a lifetime. She saw the muzzle, black and empty and cold, as if she were looking into the eyes of death itself. This is it. After everything she had endured, after Derek, after the beatings, after the endless fear, after she had finally found a sliver of peace, she would die here, in the dark, alone, in the library she had begun to call a refuge. Tears slid down her cheeks, warm and salty, and she didn't even realize she was crying. The assassin's finger tightened on the trigger. Kira shut her eyes. Bang! The gunshot ripped through the night, but she didn't feel pain, didn't feel a bullet tearing into her. She opened her eyes and saw the assassin jerk backward as if an invisible force had slammed into him. His head snapped back, blood spraying in a dark red streak across the velvet curtain behind him. He crashed to the floor, his body dropping like a sack of sand, and he didn't move again. Kira screamed, the sound tearing out of her throat, the scream of terror finally released. She curled into herself in the chair, hands clamped over her ears, eyes squeezed shut, her body shaking out of control. Footsteps came running, fast and heavy. Then hands hauled her up, strong but not rough, familiar as if she had known them all her life. A scent wrapped around her, sandalwood, gunpowder, and something that belonged only to him, Mateo. He crushed her against his chest, one hand still holding a smoking gun, the other holding her as if he feared that if he let go, she would vanish. "I've got you," he said, his voice rough and shaking, repeating it like a spell to drive the dark away. "I've got you. I've got you." Kira buried her face against him, tears soaking his shirt, her body trembling in his arms. She sobbed like she had never been allowed to sob, crying from fear, crying from relief, crying because she had almost lost everything. And Mateo didn't let go. He held her in his steel grip, shielding her from the world, from the dark, from the death that had just touched the doorway of their home. Nico and the security team rushed into the library only seconds later, guns in hand, eyes sweeping the room for threats. They took in the scene, the assassin's body on the floor, blood spreading into a dark pool under the moonlight, and their boss holding the girl, the gun still faintly smoking. Nico stepped to the body, tugged up the man's sleeve, and his jaw tightened when he saw the tattoo on the wrist. "Valetti's man," he said, voice tight. "The tattoo confirms it. This is Carlo Valetti's." Mateo lifted his head, his eyes deep wells of restrained fury. "How did he get in?" His voice was ice, sharp as a blade. Nico shook his head, grim. He cut the East security system. Professional job. He knew exactly where to hit. Mateo held Kira tighter, as if her fragile body was the only thing keeping him from exploding. "They're going to pay," he said, and his voice was no longer a man's voice. It was the voice of a storm about to break, of thunder ready to roar, of war knocking at the door. The assassin's body had been taken away, but the blood was still spread across the library's wooden floor, a dark pool beneath the dim light that no one had had time to clean. The metallic scent of blood and gunpowder lingered in the air, mixed with the smell of fear and the death that had just passed through. Kira sat on the velvet sofa, a wool blanket wrapped around her trembling shoulders, but no blanket was warm enough to drive off the cold that had seeped into her bones. She was still shaking, beyond her control, as if her body were trying to fling off the horror it had just survived. Mateo knelt in front of her on the floor, not caring that his expensive suit was brushing against the blood that hadn't dried, both hands holding hers, gripping tight as if he feared she would dissolve if he let go. Kira opened her mouth, her voice rough and broken. "This is my fault." Her eyes dropped to the blood on the floor. I brought this to you. If I wasn't here. Matteo cut her off, his voice strong and final. You brought nothing. He tightened his grip on her hands. They were already looking for a way to hurt me. Carlo Valetti has wanted to strike at me for a long time. He was only waiting for an opening. He paused, jaw clenched. They thought they found a weakness. Kira looked up, her eyes red and full of tears. A weakness? She asked, not understanding. Matteo looked at her, and in that moment his eyes changed. No longer steel cold, no longer ice. It was fire. It was storm. It was something primal and fierce she had never seen in anyone. They didn't just break the peace, Kira, he said, his voice low and trembling slightly, as if what he was about to say was something he had never said to anyone. They tried to take my heart. Kira stopped breathing, her heart racing in her chest. Your heart? She whispered, unable to believe what she'd heard. Matteo held her gaze, and for the first time she saw the most powerful mafia boss in New York look completely unguarded. You, he said, each word dragged up from deep inside him. You are my heart. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, only stared at him with wide eyes. Matteo went on, his voice like stone breaking apart. I didn't plan for this. I didn't want this. I've spent my whole life making sure no one could ever get close enough to hurt me. He paused, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. But from the moment you fell into my arms in that club, from the moment I saw those bruises, from the moment I looked into your eyes and saw someone who had survived hell and was still standing. He drew in a trembling breath. I knew I would burn the world to keep you safe. Silence filled the room, heavy and full of meaning. For the first time, the mafia boss looked vulnerable, like an ordinary man laying his heart in front of a woman and waiting to be refused. Kira said nothing. She had no words large enough to answer what he had just given her. Instead, she lifted her hand and touched his face. Gently, her fingers traced the sharp line of his cheekbone, the rough shadow of stubble from a sleepless night. The corner of his mouth held tight. Matteo closed his eyes at the feel of her hand on his skin, leaning into her palm like a thirsty man finding water in the desert. You're insane, she whispered, a small smile appearing even as tears still ran. Probably, he said, opening his eyes to look at her. I don't care. Then Matteo stood, and in an instant the softness vanished. His face hardened into steel, his eyes shifting from fire back to ice. The mafia boss returned. He turned to Nico, who was waiting at the door. Lock down the estate. Every entrance, every window, every shadow. Nico nodded. And the Valettis? Matteo looked down at the blood on the floor, jaw clenched so hard she could almost hear his teeth grind. Call the captains. All of them, he said, voice cold as ice. We're going to war. Nico didn't look surprised. He asked only one more question. Full scale? Matteo looked down at Kira, then at the blood, then at the window where the assassin had climbed in. They came into my home, he said, each word like a bullet. They tried to kill what's mine. I want them erased. Every single one. Carlo Valetti, his captains, his soldiers. I want the Valetti name to become a warning no one will ever forget. Nico nodded and disappeared into the dark. Matteo turned back to Kira and stepped close. He bent and pressed a light kiss to her forehead, his lips warm and soft, the complete opposite of the steel he'd just shown. Stay in the safe room, he murmured into her hair. I'll come back. Kira caught his hand, unwilling to let go. Promise me, she said, voice shaking. Matteo looked at her, and for a brief moment he was again the man who had told her she was his heart. I promise. Then he straightened, turned, and walked out. He didn't look back. Kira watched his silhouette vanish into the hallway's darkness, and she knew that tonight, the devil was going hunting. The safe room lay deep underground, its steel walls half a meter thick, its door so heavy it took 2 people to push it open. Inside was everything needed to survive. A folding bed with wool blankets, bottled water lined up in rows, canned food enough for an entire month, and silence. Silence heavy as lead, pressing on Kira's chest until it was hard to breathe. Nico stood guard outside the door. This time he hadn't gone with Matteo, and that left Kira unsure whether she should feel relieved or even more afraid. She sat on the bed with her sketchbook open on her lap, a pencil in her hand, but she couldn't draw. Her hand shook too much, the lines turning into meaningless scribbles on blank paper. 72 hours passed like 72 years. No phone, no news, nothing but 4 steel walls and endless waiting. Kira asked Nico every hour, sometimes every half hour, the same question scraping out of her dry throat. Is he alive? And Nico, every time, answered in the same low, steady voice. "The dawn is hard to kill, miss." But his eyes didn't match his voice. Kira saw the worry behind the calm mask, and that frightened her more than the silence. Sometimes she heard distant booms, a low thunder in the night, or maybe she only imagined it. She could no longer tell the difference. News seeped in through brief fragments of conversation from the security team. A string of gas explosions in Queens, rising gang violence, police sealing off multiple neighborhoods. Kira knew it wasn't gas. It was war. On the third night, she couldn't sleep. She lay on the bed staring at the steel ceiling, then sat up and flipped through her sketchbook, searching for a piece of peace, and she froze. This page, that page, another, all of them were Mateo. She had drawn him dozens of times without realizing it, drawn his eyes, drawn the sharp line of his cheekbones, drawn the hand that had held hers on the night of terror. Every stroke was a silent prayer. Come back, come back. If you don't come back. She couldn't finish the thought. Dawn on the fourth day, weak light slipped through the vent, marking a new day she wasn't sure she wanted to face. Kira sat up, eyes swollen from crying and sleeplessness, hair tangled, feeling like a hollow corpse. Then Nico's phone buzzed, the sound tearing through the silence like lightning. He sprang to his feet, pressed the phone to his ear, and listened. He nodded, and his face changed. Kira couldn't read the expression. She couldn't tell if it was relief or pain, and the uncertainty was killing her second by second. "What?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What is it?" Nico didn't answer. He only stepped to the steel door, set his hand on the lock, and began to open it. The bunker door swung slowly outward. Light poured in, blinding and sharp, and Kira couldn't breathe as she tried to see who was standing on the other side. The door opened fully, and light from the hallway poured into the dark bunker like a tide. So bright Kira had to narrow her eyes. 1 second. 2. Then a figure took shape in the glare. A silhouette so familiar her throat tightened. Mateo. He stood there, and he looked like a man who had walked through hell and crawled out on his own. His black tactical gear was torn to shreds, fabric ripped at the shoulder and chest, exposing cuts and bruises underneath. His left arm was wrapped in white bandages, but blood had soaked through and turned a dark ink color. His face was battered, one eye swollen nearly shut, 3 days of stubble casting a bluish shadow along his cheekbones. He stepped inside, and his gait was uneven, favoring one side as if he were hiding an injury in his leg. But he was there, alive, breathing, looking at her with eyes that were exhausted and still burning. Kira didn't think. She didn't need to. Her body moved before her mind could catch up, feet pushing off the bed, rushing across the room, slamming into him with every ounce of strength she had. She didn't care about the blood on his clothes, didn't care about the violence he had just come through, didn't care about the bodies he'd left behind. She cared about one thing only. He was still breathing. Mateo went rigid for a second when she hit him, his body tightening like a drawn wire, the reflex of a man fresh off a battlefield. Then he understood. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't turning her back and running. She was holding him as if he were the most precious thing on earth. His uninjured arm wrapped around her back, pulling her in, crushingly tight, until she could barely breathe. His face buried in her hair, inhaling deeply like a drowning man finally reaching the surface. "You're alive," Kira sobbed, tears soaking into his torn shoulder. "You're alive. You're alive." She repeated it as if saying it enough times could make it true forever. "I promised," Mateo answered, his voice raw and ragged, as if he'd been shouting too much for 3 days. "I always keep my promises." They stood there, clinging to each other in the cold bunker, and time seemed to stop. Nico quietly stepped out, closing the door behind him with the discretion of a man who'd seen too much to not know when to disappear. Mateo spoke first, his voice still rough but carrying a relief Kira had never heard from him. "It's done." Those 3 words carried the weight of an entire war. The Valettis are gone, every single one. Carlo is dead. The syndicate is dismantled. He paused, his fingers stroking lightly through her hair. "No one will ever come for you again." Kira eased back from his arms just enough to look at his face, to see the injuries, the bruises, the marks of the hell he'd waded through. "You're hurt," she said, her voice shaking. Mateo gave a slight shrug, as if the wounds were no more than mosquito bites. "It's nothing." Kira shook her head, her gaze dropping to the blood-soaked bandage on his arm. "You could have died." Mateo looked at her, and the corner of his mouth lifted, almost a smile. "But I didn't." Kira raised her hand and touched his face. Her fingers traced the bruise on his cheekbone, the rough stubble, the smear of dried blood at his temple. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in 3 days, like he had seen death and fought it with his bare hands. Matteo closed his eyes at the feel of her hand on his skin, leaning into her palm as if this were the only piece he had left after hell. Then he opened his eyes and stepped back. The expression on his face shifted, from softness to hardness, from closeness to distance. Kira felt as if a bucket of ice water had been thrown over her. "What?" she asked, stepping forward as he stepped away. "What's wrong?" Matteo didn't look at her. His gaze dropped to the floor, to the wall, anywhere but her eyes. "You saw what I am, Kira," he said, his voice flat as the surface of a deep well. "The blood, the violence, the bodies I left behind." He paused, jaw tightening. "I'm not a prince in a castle. I'm a butcher." Kira shook her head, moving closer by one step. "I know what you are." Matteo finally looked at her, and in his eyes was something she couldn't read. Pain, resolve, or surrender. "Then you know you can't stay." Kira froze, as if someone had pulled all the air out of the room. "What?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Matteo looked away again, turning his head because he couldn't bear to face those eyes while he said this. "I've arranged something. For you." Each word landed like a bullet. "A way out." Kira stepped closer and grabbed his hand, forcing him to turn back. "A way out? I don't understand." Matteo drew a deep breath, like he was bracing for a blow he knew would hurt more than any wound on his body. "I'm sending you away." Kira felt as if she'd been punched in the stomach, unable to breathe, unable to think. "Tuscany," Matteo said, his voice like stone breaking. "You'll be safe there, far from me." Matteo started speaking, his voice flat and distant, as if he were reading a business contract, not a single trace of emotion slipping through. "There's a plane. It leaves tonight." His eyes stayed fixed on empty space behind her shoulder. "I have a villa in Tuscany. Safe. Hidden. No one knows about it. Not even my closest men." He paused, as if following a script he'd prepared in advance. "You'll have money. A new identity. A new life. Everything you need to start over." Kira stood there, unable to believe her ears, while Matteo kept listing things as if he were reading a shopping list. "You can go back to school, finish your degree, open that studio you dreamed about." He looked at her for the first time since he started speaking, and in his eyes was something she didn't want to see. Surrender. The life you deserved before everything went wrong. Kira felt as if the ground beneath her feet were collapsing. "You planned all this?" she asked, her voice shaking. "When?" Matteo answered without hesitation. "I planned it the moment I realized I couldn't protect you. The moment that assassin got into my home." Kira shook her head and stepped closer. "You did protect me. You saved my life." Matteo stepped back, keeping distance, as if her closeness were something dangerous. "And next time? And the time after that?" His voice sharpened. "There will always be enemies, Kira. There will always be someone wanting to hurt me through you. There will always be danger." He looked around the steel-cold bunker. "I can't let you live in a bunker forever. That's not a life. That's a prison." Kira felt anger start to boil in her chest, mixed with pain and helplessness. "So your solution is to send me away? To another country? To the other side of the world?" Matteo looked at her, and for a moment the cold mask cracked, revealing the man underneath, a man in more pain than she was. "My solution is to set you free," he said, his voice cutting like a blade. "You are light, Kira. Everything I'm not, everything I can never be." He walked to the small bunker window and stared into the darkness beyond. "If you stay, my darkness will consume you. Dim your light until there's nothing left. I've seen it happen before. I won't let it happen to you." Kira followed and grabbed his hand, forcing him to turn and face her. "That's not your decision to make," she almost shouted. "You don't get to decide what's best for me." Matteo looked down at her hand, gripping his, then lifted his gaze, and when he spoke, his voice fractured like glass. "It is, because I love you." Silence. Those words hung in the air, heavy and painful, not the confession she'd ever dreamed of, but a goodbye. "And loving someone," Matteo went on, his voice rough, "means wanting what's best for them, even if it's not me, even if it means letting them go." Kira stared at him, at the man who had just said he loved her in the same breath he was pushing her away, and she didn't know whether she wanted to scream or cry or punch him. "You're an idiot," she said at last, her voice trembling not from tears but from rage. "You know that? You're a goddamn idiot." Matteo didn't react. He only looked at her with dead eyes. "I've been called worse." Kira stepped closer until she was right in front of him, lifting her chin to meet his gaze even though she had to rise onto her toes. Her voice cracked. "You think you're saving me? You think you're being noble?" Her words broke apart. "You're destroying me, Matteo. Don't you understand?" Tears ran down her cheeks, but she didn't bother to wipe them away. "I spent years being beaten, starved, broken. I forgot what it feels like to be safe, to be wanted, to be seen." She placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. "And the first time I feel safe, the first time I feel like I belong somewhere, you're taking it away?" Matteo stood motionless, jaw clenched so tight his muscles jumped, but he said nothing. There was nothing to say. At last, after a silence that felt endless, he spoke, his voice cold as stone. "The plane leaves at midnight." Each word landed like a hammer driving nails into a coffin. "Maria will help you pack." Then he turned his back and walked toward the bunker door, every step heavy as if he were carrying the whole world on his shoulders. In that cold bunker, a silence deeper than any grave settled between them. It was a farewell carved in stone, more painful than any wound they had ever endured. He loved her, so he had to let her go. Matteo stood at the door, his hand on the handle, not turning around. He waited for the sound of her crying, expecting her to accept the fate he had forced upon her. But instead, he heard footsteps coming closer. Kira walked up behind him and stopped so near he could feel the warmth of her body. "Turn around," she said, not in a crying voice, not pleading. "Steel." Matteo turned slowly, and what he saw made him go still. Kira stood there, eyes red but dry, no more tears. Shoulders straight, chin lifted, hands clenched at her sides. She wasn't the trembling waitress who had fallen into his arms that night anymore. She wasn't a victim. "I have something to say," she said, her voice steady, not a trace of tremble. "And you're going to listen." For the first time in his life, Matteo Corsetti, the dawn of New York's underground empire, the man who made an entire city afraid, didn't know what to do. Kira stepped closer and stopped one pace away, close enough to see every bruise on his face, close enough to hear the beat of his heart. "You asked me once who hurt me," she began, her voice so steady it surprised even her. Matteo nodded, silent, his eyes never leaving her. "And you dealt with him. You saved me from him." She continued, weighing each word as if it mattered. "You paid my debt, gave me a home, protected me, fed me, healed me." She paused and drew in a deep breath. "You went to war for me, Matteo. You almost died. You killed God knows how many people. You burned an entire empire to the ground." Her gaze locked on his. "And now you're telling me to leave? You're sending me away like a package you don't want anymore?" Matteo opened his mouth, his voice hoarse. "Because it's what's best." Kira lifted her hand and cut him off. "I wasn't finished." She took one more step, and now they were so close her breath warmed his chest. "You asked who hurt me," she said, softer now, but no less fierce. "But you never asked who saved me." Matteo held still, and Kira saw his breathing change, his chest rising faster. She reached for his hand, the hand bruised and scraped from 3 days of war, the hand that had killed for her, the hand that had held her when she shook with fear. She pressed that hand to her own chest, right over the heart hammering beneath thin fabric. "You did, Matteo," she whispered, her eyes beginning to shine with tears, even as her voice stayed firm. "Not just from Derek, from myself." She held his hand tight, not letting him pull away. "I was a ghost before you caught me. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be alive, to laugh, to dream, to want anything more than just surviving another day." Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "You gave me that back. You gave me back the parts of myself I thought were dead forever." Kira looked straight into his eyes, and in that moment she was no longer the frightened girl being beaten. She was a woman who had walked through hell and found heaven where no one would have expected it. "You think you're the darkness?" she asked, a small smile lifting her mouth. "But you're the only light I've ever known, the only warmth in a world that was nothing but cold." She shook her head. "I don't want Tuscany. I don't want your villa or your money or your new identity." Her voice strengthened. "I don't want safe. I don't want easy. I don't want a life where I wake up every day in some beautiful countryside wondering if you're alive, wondering if someone's hurting you, wondering if I'll ever see you again." She moved closer still, her body pressing to his, feeling his heat through the fabric. "I want the man who caught me when I fell. I want the monster who burned the world to keep me warm. I want the devil who looked at my bruises and decided someone was going to die." She placed her other hand on his chest, right over his heart. I want you, Matteo Corsetti. All of you. The darkness, the danger, the blood, everything. I want everything you are and everything you'll become. Matteo stared at her, and Kira saw something she never thought she would see. The steel wall he had built his whole life, the wall that kept him separate from the world, from feeling, from weakness, was cracking right in front of her. If you stay, he said, and his voice trembled, the first time she had ever heard him tremble. You are mine. The word struck like an oath, like a sentence, like a promise. Forever. Do you understand? There is no walking away after this. No second chance to leave. No changing your mind. He caught her chin, his thumb brushing her cheek. You will be the queen of this world, with all its blood and darkness and death. You will stand beside me, not behind me. You will be loved and feared and protected and trapped all at once. His eyes burned on hers. Can you live with that? Can you live with being mine forever? Kira didn't blink, didn't hesitate, didn't fear. I've been living in hell for years, Matteo, she answered, and a smile bloomed on her mouth, real, radiant, and wild. At least with you, hell has a view. Matteo laughed, the sound startling, ragged, and so beautiful it made Kira want to cry. It was the first time she had heard him truly laugh, not a cold smile or a bitter edge, but the laugh of a man being handed something he never thought he deserved. You're insane, he said, but his voice was full of love. Kira laughed too, and at last her tears fell, but they were happy tears. You keep saying that. Maybe I am. Maybe you made me insane. She cupped his cheek, her fingers brushing the bruise. But I'm not walking away. I'm already home. Matteo didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He pulled her in, one arm circling her waist, the other hand bracing the back of her neck, and he kissed her. This wasn't a gentle kiss from a romantic movie. This was the kiss of two people who had crossed hell and found each other on the other side. It tasted of blood from his cracked lips, of salt from her tears, of gunpowder and war and 3 days without sleep. But more than anything, it tasted like victory. Kira kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer, closer, as if she wanted to become part of him. She had chosen. She chose darkness over Tuscany's safe light. She chose danger over peace. She chose him, with all the blood and darkness and the monster inside. And the darkness chose to keep her, holding her tight, like the most precious treasure, like the heart he had thought he'd lost long ago. No plane, no Tuscany, no new identity, no new life. Because she had found her life right here, in the arms of the devil. She was home. 6 months passed like a dream Kira never wanted to wake from. She finished an online graphic design course, studying each night in the 2-story library while Matteo read beside her. He turned a room in the west wing of the mansion into a studio for her, with a professional drafting table, the newest computer, and natural light pouring in through tall windows. She began taking small projects, designing logos, building branding for businesses she never asked about, and little by little, she learned how to live in this world, not like a prisoner in a gilded cage, but like a queen in her own kingdom. The bruises on her body had healed long ago, her skin smooth and healthy from full meals and sleep untouched by nightmares. But more than that, the wounds inside her were healing too, day by day, smile by smile, night after night as she slept in Matteo's arms without waking in fear. One night, Matteo came home with a gold-embossed envelope in his hand. The gilded cage had reopened after major renovations, and he had been invited to the grand reopening as a new investor. Come with me, he said, setting the envelope on the table. Kira looked at him, her heart beating faster. Back there? Where She didn't finish, but they both knew what she meant. The place where she had been an invisible waitress. The place where she had fainted from exhaustion and hunger. The place where she had fallen into his arms. Matteo stepped close and lifted her chin. Where we met. Where you fell into my arms. Where everything began. He looked into her eyes, and she saw the gentleness only she was allowed to see. I want to replace that memory. I want you to walk in there not as who you were, but as who you are now. Come with me, Kira. Let me show the world my queen. That night, Kira stood before the large mirror in the master bedroom. The mirror unbroken, uncracked, reflecting a woman she wouldn't have dared to dream she could become 6 months earlier. A blood-red evening gown hugged her body, the open back revealing smooth skin with no scars left behind, her graceful throat adorned with a simple diamond necklace Matteo had given her for her birthday. Her hair was pinned up, exposing the curve of her neck and shoulders. Her makeup soft, but enough to bring out eyes that had cried too much and now knew only how to smile. She stared at the woman in the mirror, and it took her a moment to recognize her. No, she recognized her. This was her. This was Kira Lawson. She should have been this woman from the beginning. Before Derek, before her father's debt, before the years of pain stole everything. Mateo appeared behind her in the mirror. A perfect black tuxedo, hair slicked back, steel eyes brightening as he looked at her. Beautiful, he said. And it wasn't a compliment. It was the truth. The black limousine pulled up in front of the gilded cage, and Kira saw the crowd of paparazzi and guests waiting outside. Flashbulbs exploded like lightning when the door opened. Nico stepped out and opened the door for Mateo, and Mateo emerged in his flawless tuxedo, shoulders squared, chin lifted, every inch of him a king in his own territory. The crowd fell silent, respectful, afraid. Then Mateo turned back and extended his hand toward the car. Kira placed her hand in his and stepped out. The crowd went silent for a heartbeat. Then whispers burst like waves. Who is she? Who is she? Why is Corsetti bringing a woman? She's stunning. Kira stood tall, shoulders back, her hand resting lightly on Mateo's arm. They walked into the club, through the doors she had once slipped through 6 months ago. Afraid of being late, afraid of losing her job, afraid of Derek. Across the floor where she had served with her head down, invisible, straight to table 1, the table she had once been afraid to look at, the table of kings and queens of the underworld. The table was set, red roses, candles glowing, aged red wine in crystal glasses. They sat down, Mateo and Kira, side by side, like a king and queen on a throne. Kira looked down at the spot on the floor nearby, where she had fainted 6 months before, where she had thought her life was over, where Mateo had caught her, where her old life ended and her new life began. Are you okay? Mateo asked, his hand finding hers beneath the table. Kira looked at him, and a smile bloomed on her lips, radiant and true. I'm perfect. Jazz began to play, a familiar melody filling the elegant room. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, red wine shone like ruby in the glass, and Kira Lawson, the girl who had once been an abused waitress, thin, invisible, no one bothering to look, now sat at table 1 beside the most dangerous man in New York, not as prey, not as property, as an equal, as a queen. Mateo lifted his glass, his eyes never leaving her. To falling, he said, his voice low and warm. Kira lifted her own glass and clinked it to his, the crystal ringing like a bell. And to being caught, she answered. They drank, and the world spun around them, the crowd, the music, the lights. But in that moment, only the two of them existed. The king had returned, and the queen sat beside him. And that is the story of Kira and Mateo, from an abused waitress who fell into the arms of darkness to the queen of New York's underworld. This story reminds us that sometimes light can come from the darkest places, that salvation doesn't always wear white, and that being loved does not depend on how perfect you are, but on finding someone who truly sees who you are. If you are going through difficult days, remember that every wound can heal, every darkness can fade, and sometimes the one who saves you will come from where you least expect it. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share this video with the people you love, the people who believe in second chances and the power of love. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell so you don't miss our gripping stories every day. We would love to know how you feel about Kira and Mateo's story. Have you ever lived through moments that felt impossible to overcome? Do you believe love can come from unexpected places? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We listen to every story, every thought from the deepest places in your hearts. Thank you for staying with us through Kira and Mateo's journey. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.